Okay, so they lost again and pretty badly at that, which makes it 3 in a row now, and they're getting closer and closer to not being in a playoff spot, but it's not time to panic just yet. Don't panic. Don't panic. Oh, holy sh! What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back to Kraken R&R, where, yes, the Kraken do lose their third straight, falling 5-1 at home to the Toronto Maple Leafs, who come into Seattle and return the favor for what the Kraken did to them a few weeks ago on that 7-win road trip, during which they beat Toronto in Toronto by the same 5-1 score. And also, even outside of just this one game in the bigger picture, with the loss, it does now put the Kraken at 3-6-1 in their last 10, which is not only the worst last 10 games for any team in the division, it's the worst last 10 game stretch for any team in the Western Conference, and is starting to muddy things a bit in the bigger picture for the Kraken and what their chances are of making the playoffs. So with that being said, and after having thought about it for a little while and how I wanted to approach this R&R after that disappointing performance against a good Maple Leafs team, and we still will get to that game, first I want to take a little bit of a step back and, well, give Kraken fans a bit of a chance to have some R&R. Now, normally here R&R stands for recap and reaction, but in case you hadn't caught it, there's a clever reference there to the rest and relaxation type of R&R. It's not that clever, but I think this is a good time to maybe have a little bit more of that step back and look at the bigger picture and where things are at for the Kraken here as we get into the home stretch of the season, and still a very good chance to make the postseason for the first time. Now again, yes, it's true that things have not been going particularly well for the Kraken lately, who have been, well, scuffling to put it lightly. Like I just said, they have the worst last 10 game stretch of any team in the Western Conference, and even over their last 17 games since the end of that great road trip and 8-game winning streak in late January, the team is just 6-9-2, so even outside of these last 10, it hasn't been going great of late. But that was also kind of the case in December after the team had a great November and then started to scuffle a bit around the Christmas break, leading right up until that great road trip that got them right back in the hunt, and more than that, put them atop the Pacific Division where they stayed for a couple weeks. Of course, though, a division lead, which now, thanks to how the last few weeks and especially the stretch since the All-Star break has gone, has gotten away from them. In fact, at this point, they find themselves just 4 points inside a playoff spot, ahead of the Calgary Flames, who are the last team on the outside looking in the Western Conference. But the first bit of good news for the Kraken, at least, is that while they've been having their issues of late, so has just about every other team in the Western Conference, as nobody that's in a playoff spot seems all that interested in running away with things. Really, the only team doing well of late has been the Colorado Avalanche, and I think we all pretty much saw that coming. Heck, even the Calgary Flames, who have been slowly getting closer to the Kraken, are just 3-4-3 over their last 10, so while that is 2 points better than the Kraken, it's the same number of wins, and just a couple of overtime losses that have eked them a little bit closer. Meanwhile, the Oilers, who by points in the standings have passed the Kraken, are blowing leads faster than the Canucks earlier this season, and are also having their own issues. And while I will still admit that it is a little bit concerning that the Kraken are again just those 4 points inside a playoff spot, they are also those 4 points and a game in hand still over the Flames. Meanwhile, at the same time, even though Vegas has started to pick things up again, they're still just 6 points ahead of the Kraken with the same number of games played. So even with things looking a little bit more iffy than they were a month ago, the Kraken are still as close to the lead in the division as they are being outside of the playoffs. Now, that's all well and good, but obviously the Kraken do need to start getting back to winning some more games, especially winning more than they're losing, if they want to keep their current spot or even start to climb back into those top 3 spots in the division, or have any chance at catching the Golden Knights for the division lead. But there's good news there too, as the Kraken have one of the 2 or 3, or maybe even the easiest schedule left in the entire NHL. As their very next game, they'll face a Blues team who's pretty much sold off their entire roster already. Then they get the Columbus Blue Jackets, the Ducks twice, the Arizona Coyotes 3 more times, as well as the Blackhawks and Canucks each once. Of course, with some other games mixed along in there, they still have Dallas 3 times, and Nashville, who also is in the hunt still at this point, although that's pretty much just UC Saros doing that by himself. So it's not a total cakewalk, and as we've already seen recently against the Sharks, the game that started this current 3-game losing streak, and a Sharks team the Kraken will also get to see one more time this season, even those easier games are not a guarantee. But at the very least, the Kraken are set up with their schedule to be able to win more games than not over the rest of the season if they can take care of business. So who knows, if they are able to do that, maybe those last 2 games of the season against the Golden Knights could end up deciding the division. Anyway, all of that is to say that while things have been a bit frustrating of late to be a Kraken fan, especially with these last 3 losses, with the blown lead at the end of the Boston game, this Toronto game going, well, just not very well, and of course the San Jose game, which I still contend might be the worst game the Kraken have ever played, they are still in a pretty good spot to make that first playoff appearance, and once you're there, anything can happen. Plus, even outside of all that, if you're willing to take an even bigger step back to where we were at this point last year as Seattle sports fans, and I know not everybody here is more than just a Kraken fan as far as Seattle sports are concerned, but we are now just about a week away from the year anniversary of one of the darkest days in Seattle sports. Well, outside of just about the entirety of 2008, but I've already done a full video about that you can go watch if you really want to relive that horrendous year. But it was March 8th of last year that the Seahawks got rid of, in different ways, both Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner, who, for the Seahawks, had been really the 2 big figures in Seattle sports, or at least the faces of what had been the one team that had been holding things down over the last decade. And I know I'm going to hear about it from Sounders and Storm fans, where Subban and the Storm have been killing it over that same amount of time and continue to do so of late, where the Seahawks had been having issues, and the Sounders have won a couple of titles in the MLS. But as far as the bigger teams anyway, it was pretty much the Seahawks that have been running the show, and the departure of those 2, plus not really knowing where the Mariners were at. Yeah, we were hopeful for the future, but we're still really kind of waiting for that to materialize after Seager had retired and Felix the year before that. And then, of course, yes, also the letdown that had been the inaugural season for the Kraken, who were, I don't think they were quite mathematically eliminated at this point last year, but I mean, they basically were. And pretty much at this point, we were just kind of hoping that they would lose close games to get better chances at the first overall pick. Of course, they ended up getting the player at the 4th pick that they would have taken with the 1st pick in Shane Wright. And that's kind of part of how things have really turned around over this last year. Now, of course, again, looking at it from the full Seattle sports perspective, the biggest story over this last year since a year ago was the Mariners breaking the 20-plus year playoff drought and the emergence of Julio Rodriguez. Then, of course, Geno Smith and the Seahawks took what everyone was kind of expecting was going to be one of the worst teams in the NFL and getting one of the top picks in this next year's draft, and ended up making the playoffs. Of course, with that being said, they'll still get one of the top picks in this year's draft because Russell Wilson and the Broncos completely fell on their face, to the delight also of all Seahawks fans. While the Seahawks were shocking the NFL world with how successful they were able to be with no expectations, the Kraken were doing the same in the NHL and are continuing to build off of that. Where, coming into the season, once again, everyone was kind of expecting a Kraken team that, well, they'd probably be a little bit better with the additions they'd made in Burakovsky and Bjorkstrand, plus Matty Beniers in his first season that, well, let's face it, even with how things have been going, everyone kind of expected that he would be the front runner for the Calder. Everyone expected a better season, but nothing like what the Kraken have been able to do, and certainly not a season that had them in a playoff spot in the home stretch. So look, I get that none of this is news to anybody. We've mentioned throughout the course of this season, and really it's been the big story with the Kraken, of how much of a surprise the fact that this team is actually playoff competitive has been. But I still do think that, especially after, well, how the last 10 games and how this game against the Maple Leafs went, for the Kraken to still be a few points inside the playoffs, it is worth maybe taking that step back and looking at just how well things have gone over this last year and how happily any of us a year ago would have taken where the team is at this point. Even if the last little bit of a stretch has been a bit frustrating now that we've come to expect more winning than losing. Finally, getting back to this game specifically against the Maple Leafs, where the Kraken get, let's face it, blown out at home 5-1. Well, yeah, There's no way around the fact that the team needs to play better than they did in this game and play more like the team we saw against Boston over the rest of this season. But even at that, this wasn't a terribly played game, and while it isn't fun to admit, honestly, the Kraken just got beat by a better team. Now, yes, I'm sure that some people are going to want to argue with that statement, and after all, the Kraken did beat Toronto 5-1 with that same score earlier on the season, so the season series between the two teams is tied at 6-6. But the standings don't lie. The Maple Leafs are one of the 4 best teams in the NHL, and even though the Kraken have won the same number of playoff series as Toronto has since 2004, it is a Toronto team that is just more talented than the Kraken are. They might not have the same depth that the Kraken do, but as we saw tonight, that top end is much more capable of taking advantage of mistakes when handed them than the Kraken are able to with their top end. At least right now, anyway. And as we do finally get into the game, well, that's pretty much what we saw play out in the first period that ultimately ended up being the difference. Of course, Toronto widens the gap as the game goes along, but the Kraken at that point were trying to play catch-up and were just not quite able to do it. Of course, things started out great for the Kraken as the Maple Leafs were pretty sloppy in their end of the ice, turning over the puck on a number of occasions and just couldn't get passes cleanly through the neutral zone. One of which is intercepted by Jared McCann at the blue line, still keeping the offensive end, as I think it was Morgan Riley tried to clear the puck. McCann again keeping the zone, gets the puck quickly down to Eberle, who finds Dunn crashing into the slot, getting into the play, and Dunn fires off the shot and puts it into the back of the net to give the Kraken the early 1-0 lead. As for the second game in a row, they take that early lead against one of the best teams the NHL has to offer. But unfortunately, although Bjorkstrand would get a pretty good chance to make it 2-0 shortly after Dunn scores, another part of that game against the Bruins carries over into this one, and that was a quick response goal, as it turns out to be the old Kraken captain Mark Giordano who puts it right through traffic and through the 5-hole, just barely of Grubauer, less than a minute later to tie the game at 1. Okay, it was a little over a minute, but same difference. And really, from pretty much that point on, about 5 minutes into the first, well, again, the Maple Leafs weren't playing the cleanest hockey in their end of the ice. They were also spending the majority of the time in the Kraken end, where the Kraken were, well, pretty much doing the same thing, and uncharacteristically of how they've played in their end this season, really allowing a lot of uncontested traffic out in front of the net, which the Maple Leafs were able to take advantage of 2 more times in this period. The first one coming a few minutes later as a puck that's shot on net from outside bounces off of traffic in front, right out to Tavares on the other side, who's unchallenged, and he's able to put it into the back of the net without really that much trouble. Then 5 minutes after that, it's another defensive breakdown, this time not so much right out in front of the net, although there were a lot of chances coming from there that Grubauer was having to stop. This one is more just a full zone problem as all 5 Kraken players get sucked into the corner caught puck watching. The puck ends up out of the corner, still in control of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they quickly find Timothy Liljegren, who's wide open on the far side. The pass gets to him, and he puts it in the net before Grubauer has a chance to get to the other side with the wide open shot. There really wasn't much of a chance for Grubauer on that one, and it's 3-1. Not long after that, Toronto would get a power play, which Grubauer has to make a spectacular save during in order to keep this from being a 4-1 score going into the break. And actually, for Grubauer, it was more than just the one spectacular save. It was a couple of pretty nice saves back to back, as he makes a good save on a clean shot from Matthews in tight. That rebounds out to, I think it was Tavares again, who's gonna have a clean shot, but Grubauer is able to push off of the inside of the net with one skate to get his toe while laid out on the ground after making the save on Matthews the entire time, is able to push off the inside of the net with one foot to get his other foot just in time to the other post to shut down Tavares before he can just tap the puck into the net again. So after 1, the score is 3-1 Toronto, and while the Kraken were able to clean things up a little bit during the second and third period, early on in the second, it's more problems in front of the net as a rebound off of Grubauer hops up in the air. And admittedly, this is kind of just a nice play as Austin Matthews is able to whack his own rebound out of the air and into the net just over the pad of Grubauer, who was stretched out again to make the nice save, had the puck been along the ice, but Matthews plays some baseball and puts it into the net to make it 4-1. Kraken did actually have a pretty good press through most of the rest of the second period and really good press during a power play that they would get here shortly after. A power play that they would get 2 chances on tonight, and while they didn't score on either one, it's a power play that they played well enough that if they're able to play that well on this power play the rest of the season, well, they're going to get those percentages going up. Even if they don't end up scoring on these two, generally speaking, a power play should be expected to score around a fifth of the time, a fourth of the time if you're going really well like Toronto has for most of the season. So going 0 for 2 isn't a big deal as long as you're playing well, and the Kraken did do that. They just weren't able to convert on it, which is unfortunate because it does mean we'll end up going to a third period with the Maple Leafs still leading 4-1. Now, this is the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they've blown 4-1 leads somewhat famously in the third period before, but it's not something you can really expect happening all that often, and they certainly don't do it here. In fact, they end up adding on another one. Once again, it's Austin Matthews. This time, it's he in that first line along with Marner. They just create a play themselves, catching the Kraken defense. I think it was Larson and Dunn again, flat-footed. They just push past the Kraken on a 3-on-2, or maybe it was a 3-on-3 rush. Either way, the pass gets through everybody from one side from Marner to the other side to Matthews, who just kind of taps it into the side of the net on the fly, and, well, that makes it 5-1 and pretty much put the game away. Now, I will say for the Kraken that the final score of 5-1, I do think is a bit disingenuous for how the overall flow of this game felt. Toronto still played like the better team and deserved to win this game, but I think it was a lot closer than that 5-1 score ends up looking, especially with the Kraken, I think, got the better of Toronto in the second period, and maybe even slightly so in the third, although obviously Toronto ends up coming away with the only goals in both of those periods to extend their lead from the 3-1 at the end of the first to that 5-1. I also forgot to mention that when that fourth goal went in early on in the second, Hackstall did make the decision to switch Grubauer out for Jones. And for Grubauer, it certainly wasn't his best night. He definitely didn't look like he was on and playing the way that we've seen him play over the last month or so. But even at that, outside of the first goal that he lets in through the 5-hole by Giordano, the last 3 really he wasn't given much of a chance on, as the defense in front of him was, well, kind of reminiscent of where we were at last season, like we already talked about. Now, Samsonov in net for the Maple Leafs after allowing that first goal was fantastic and made a number of pretty big saves to keep this game, well, the final score looking as lopsided as it was, as the Kraken definitely should have scored probably 3 or 4 goals to make this a little bit closer. Unfortunately, that's just not able to happen, and with that first period, especially the last 15 minutes of that first period where they kind of just let Toronto run their show, it put them behind where they had to try and play catch up, and that stretched out their defense a little bit and allowed those further mistakes to end up happening where the lead got extended. So the silver lining, I guess you could call it, that I'll take away from this game, especially the way the Kraken played those last 2 periods, is that if they're able to play the way they did in those last 2 periods, they're gonna beat these bad teams that we've already talked about that they should beat coming up here over the rest of the season. Teams that just don't have the talent that Toronto does to take advantage at the other end of the ice, and, well, also doesn't have the talent they do to recover from mistakes they make in their end. We already saw that against the Flyers, and even a hot Red Wings team in those last 2 wins the Kraken got, where, especially against the Flyers, I'll be honest, there were a lot of sloppy plays the Kraken had in their defensive end and neutral zone that the Flyers just downright weren't good enough to take advantage of, and the Kraken could recover and turn it back into rush chances the other way. Meanwhile, at the other end, they weren't good enough to recover from their own mistakes, and with Toronto, we saw that they were able to not only take advantage of Seattle's mistakes, but were better prepared to recover from the mistakes they made. Now, I understand, to those of you who look at things a little bit more glass half empty, this might all just sound like coping, as things are still not going well, as we've mentioned a few times. But I really do believe that the Kraken, if they're able to play the way they did against Boston, who is still the best team in the NHL, and the way they did in these last 2 periods against Toronto, they're going to have success over the rest of the season, or at least enough success to easily make the playoffs given the spot that they're in currently. Now, that being said, I still don't think they've been playing as well as they can play and have played for stretches this season over these last few games. And the way that they're playing will still probably end up getting them beat by teams like Colorado or Dallas, who they still face 3 times. But the good news is that they face more lacking talent teams than teams that have talent and will probably end up making the playoffs throughout these last 23 games. Anyway, this whole video has been kind of rambly and here and there, and yeah, I'll be honest, maybe a little bit of coping, but honestly, I think it was time to kind of just take a step back. And while we got some anger and frustration out with that San Jose game, I think it was very warranted there, the way that one was approached versus this one. Yeah, it's another bad loss, but it's to a team that, well, let's be honest, it's fair to lose badly to teams that are as good as the Maple Leafs are, regardless of whether or not you like the fact that they're good. Though, even with all that having been said about silver linings, as far as Kraken 3 stars, I mean, I think Jared McCann probably played well enough to get a star, as well as Jaden Schwartz. I don't know if there's really a third. Beniers had some good plays, but also had some tough ones. He had a turnover in the Kraken defensive end that led to that first Matthews goal there at the start of the second period. And honestly, he played decently well, matched up pretty frequently against Austin Matthews, but it was clear that Austin Matthews, I mean, he should be the better player, but Beniers was definitely getting beat more often than not in that matchup. But I don't know. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. If you guys have 3 stars for this game that you can find, or what your thoughts are about where the Kraken are at this point this season. Are you worried about the Flames potentially catching up to them? Or do you, like me, think that there's a good chance that with the rest of the way the schedule looks, they can figure things out here and still make the playoffs and see where they go from there? Anyway, if you have made it to this point, hopefully this video helped a little bit some of the frustrations of these last 3 games. And thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy it, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. And until next time, against, again, a Blues team that has pretty much traded everyone of value away at this point, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.